Welcome back to the virtual hangar. Today we're going to do one of my favorite projects, which is a t-shirt quilt. If you don't have a lot of experience sewing and you've never made a quilt before, this is a great place to start. The first thing you're going to need to do is go ahead and clean out your closet of all those special t-shirts that you just can't get rid of but you don't really wear anymore. These are usually these Hanes beefy tees or these Gildan ones, the free ones you get for participating on like a team for sports. I guess mine are all band t-shirts, so you know I didn't do sports, but this kind of heavy cotton is going to be the easiest kind to work with. Step after cleaning out your shirts is cutting them into perfect squares. If you have a clear acrylic ruler like I do here, I'm going to use that 90-degree angle to cut all of my t-shirts. Lots of quilters have these. Most non-quilters maybe don't have one of these in their house. So you can get that 90-degree angle from using, say, any book you might have in your house. But I'm actually going to show you the next couple minutes a method to make your own cutting guide. I'm using the flaps off of a Home Depot box. I'm going to use the perfect straight sides that the machines cut and not the kind of crooked side that I cut with scissors off the box. And I'm going to be using also an X-Acto knife to cut a 15-inch by 15-inch square of cardboard that I'm going to use as the guide to cut all of my t-shirts. T-shirt is a difficult material to sew. It's stretchy in one direction and not stretchy in the other direction. So if you don't have a lot of sewing experience, it can be difficult to use on your machine. For that reason, t-shirt quilts, I think it's the best to just make a square. So what I've done is I've measured a 5 inches off of each of these flaps, which are 5-ish plus inches, and I cut a perfectly straight line using my ruler, and then I'm just taping them together. So I'm putting the two sides that were machine cut. That gives me two perfect clean parts together, and then one of the rough edges that I cut, and then I'm just taping it down right across that seam, so I can have a perfectly 15-inch wide square. And then I'm taking my ruler and cutting off one edge. I lined the other edge up with each other, and then I'm just cutting those 15 inches off. So once I have those 3 flaps, I'm just taking some tape, taping it all together. I have one solid 15-inch by 15-inch piece. To cut your squares out, an iron might be helpful. I almost never iron anything I'm sewing, which makes me a bad technical sewist, but I just don't have the energy. I'm not doing it. It's fine. It turns out fine. So you're going to smooth down your t-shirt as best as you can with your hands, and then take your cardboard square and put it over the design of your shirt. You can see that the 15 inches covers the entire design of my shirt. It's a medium standard t-shirt perfectly, and it gives you a little bit of room around the design on each side. I would say at least 1 inch to 2 inches. 15 inches is probably going to be too big for your cardboard square if you are a size small t-shirt person, but I am not, so it's perfectly fine, and I like to get the whole design, so I go as big as I can. Once I have it all flat and centered, I will pick up the cardboard a little bit and just make sure that it's, perfectly straight, perfectly flat. Then I'm going to take these binder clips. If you had more, that would probably be better. But I'm going to start at the bottom of the t-shirt, the part that you would stick your head through first. And I just take the binder clips and clip the bottom of the t-shirt to the cardboard. Then as I lift it off of the table, make sure when you're clipping this, by the way, you don't want to pull it too tight. You just want it to rest perfectly flat so that you can see where the edge of the cardboard square is going to be. Then I am going to take my scissors and just cut off all of that extra t-shirt. So I have these scissors I use only for fabric. They're extra sharp, and that makes sure I get a good clean line. But if you don't have, fabric special scissors, you can of course use regular scissors. Once I cut off the bottom flap of t-shirt, you can see I just followed right along the edge of the cardboard, and it takes a little bit of practice, and ultimately if the edge isn't clean, if you're not great at scissors, it's not the end of the world. None of those rough edges, what they're called, are going to show in the final project. So I take the binder clip from the bottom left hand corner and I don't move the t-shirt from the cardboard at all, and then I go ahead and move it to the top right corner. So I didn't move the bottom right binder clip, I'm basically moving it every other to make sure that from each cut I make, I'm leaving one binder clip. That make sure that it's not getting accidentally shifted across the whole square, and it's going to make sure that I keep all of those 90-degree angles. I'm going to be able to tell once I'm done cutting them all out whether I ended up missing or not, but you can see here I've just followed along of my square and then I have it all square. I do take a straight pin here at the top and pin the two pieces together, front and back, and then I fold it into thirds and kind of make this little nice rectangle fold that is helpful when I'm laying out the final project. Keep everything together and do all of your t-shirts just like this. So that's how I did it when the back of the t-shirt is blank, but I have a couple of t-shirts like this one here where the design on the back is in a kind of a different location than the design on the front is. I am ultimately making these t-shirt quilts for nostalgia, so I want to be preserving the designs on the t-shirt as best as I can. So whenever that happens, what I do is I actually just cut the front and back separately. I start by cutting the sleeves off of the t-shirt and then cutting it across the neck. That part isn't going to get on the t-shirt square anyways, so cutting it fine. And then I do cut the straight down the side seams, but there's usually not seams there on a t-shirt. And then I do just cut those squares out separately using the same method. So you just move the binder clips around. If you have 4 binder clips, you don't have to worry about moving them. I just only own 2, I guess. So I don't move them. But just go one side at a time, cut as close to the cardboard as you can, and then just set them aside and then cut the back. You can see here, because I was able to cut the front to the back, I was able to center the design a little bit more. It was still kind of like, oh, it'll be between your shoulder blades, but it allows you to scoot up a little bit closer to the neck of the t-shirt than I would have been able to if I just cut straight down through both of them. So then I take the back, I put the front on top of the back and fold it in the exact same way in thirds, and then I fold it up in half, and then I do all of my t-shirts that way. So I finished cutting out 2. I have 10 more to do. Keep in mind that the instructions for this project are going to change depending on how many shirts you ultimately end up cleaning out from your closet. The number of shirts you have is going to change the way you make your quilt, and that number has to be square. 9 shirts works fine. 10 shirts, 11 shirts doesn't make a rectangle. I'm using 12 for this one here because that's all of my shirts from college. And I am going to show you how I kind of arrange them. So I know that I'm going to do these 4 identical ones on the corners. I have these 2 thematically that are kind of different, and then I have these 4 other Carolina t-shirts. So I will kind of just play with them in these smaller rectangles instead of having the whole thing folded out. And I just rearrange them until I decide that I like how the design looks. And then I will go ahead and just stack them up by row. So I'm stacking what will be the 3rd row onto the 4th row. And then I'm going to take the 2nd row, stack it on top of the 3rd, and then I'm going to take the top row and stack it on top of that. So it's important just to, once you have that design, sometimes I take a picture. I'm taking a video here, so I didn't need to, but do keep in mind the final design you want your quilt to have, and then keep these stacks in order. I like to work the rest of the quilt directly from these stacks. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that really quickly because it can get kind of confusing. Most important, cut all your squares, design your layout, stack them up, put them aside. So after you've got all that done, the next thing we're going to do is start to sew. I pick the darkest color thread that I have in common across all of my t-shirts, and then you are going to need a sewing machine for this project. I'm not going to get into the specifics of how to thread it, but generally you start up here at the top, you go around this one, you go down, you go back up, and then you go down. Most sewing machines have, you can see here, some sort of diagram or number. I hear a lot from patrons that they don't know how to thread their sewing machine, and if you're home and you have one but you don't know how to use it, feel free to send us an email and I will do my best to guide you through that one by one because they all are a little bit different. This is just the one I have, so I'm going to use that one today. You might also like to use some masking tape. This is my favorite sewing trick. So I will take this masking tape, even if your dog has eaten the roll like mine, and just cut a strip about the length of the bottom of my sewing machine here, usually like 6 inches, 8 inches, whatever. So it wraps around, and I will line it up with the ruler that's on the metal bottom here of my sewing machine, and instead of trying to follow that silver line that's impossible to see while you're sewing, I will just keep the edge of my fabric lined up with this piece of masking tape. So you do want to use a contrasting color, not Scotch tape. That's why masking tape is great. For this project, I'm going to start with like a 5/8 seam allowance, and you can see here a little bit better from a different angle what I mean. But that's going to help us keep our lines straight for the project and give us a good margin from that raw edge. So normally I like to show you guys the project as I do it in order, but you can see my top row here, and the two of the shirts are identical, so it's going to make it a little bit confusing if I try and show you how I pin all these together. So I'm actually just going to quickly kind of do the top row in the corner of the screen and explain to you how to assemble the shirt. So we've got the fronts, which is the design that would go on your chest facing out. Normally when we sew, we like to sew with what's called the right sides together, so that lets your raw edges be on the inside of whatever you're making. So if you sewed A and B together, you would put the faces of the two t-shirts together, sew along the right side, and then the seam would be on the back side. And that's definitely how we're going to do the front. So what we'll do is we'll assemble all of the rows into 4 kind of strips of t-shirt, and then we'll sew those 4 strips together, right sides together, and leave the wrong side inside with the seam. But when we cut our t-shirts in stacks, it cut through both A and B. So the wrong side of our t-shirt is facing the wrong way as it's stacked on our table. So we actually need to flip all of our t-shirts when we're doing the back side. Instead of doing it A to B to C, we're actually going to do it C to B to A. So I'm just unpinning the first row I've got here, and you can see a little bit more what I mean, and you'll definitely see as I do the second row kind of with you so you get an idea. So this is the front of my t-shirts and the back of my t-shirts, and you can see all the seams would be on the inside, even though I did it ABC for the front and CBA for the back. So here you'll get what I mean. I'm going to do the second row. All of my t-shirts are different for this row, so I thought it would be a little bit easier for you to see. So I always start, I actually do the front and the back at the same time per row. That helps me make sure I don't mess up my design. So I'm going to start with the first 2 t-shirts of the second row. So I've got this one here on the left, this darker Tar Heel Transfers one, and then this light blue Carolina blue middle one. So you can see I take the middle t-shirt and put the right side against the right side of the left t-shirt, which I should actually say the correct side and not the back side of the fabric. So the 2 designs of what would be the 2 fronts of my t-shirts, I stack on top of each other. You're going to want to kind of center align these. No matter how hard you try to cut these squares absolutely identical, they're never going to be lined up. So what I do is just kind of take the average of the middle either direction so that it's about the middle of everything. So I've got the wrong side here facing up of the back, and I am going to go ahead and pin the front sides together so that when I open it up after I've sewed it, the seams will be on what will be the inside of the quilt. So you can see here what I mean. I'm going to go ahead and pin this side that's on the right side of your screen together, and that'll be the side I sew on. If you have questions about this, I am so more than happy to help you. You can go ahead, same thing for earlier, you can email us at hangar@placentialibrary.org, and I will do my best to walk you through whatever problem you're having specifically. I try and do these tutorials not so specifically for the exact project I'm making because I'm trying to tailor them to what you might have at home. So I'm just really quickly going to pin the rest of this side so you can see. So I've done the front 2 t-shirts of the second row here, and now I am going to actually move to the back t-shirts. So I like to go directly through the t-shirt, 1 t-shirt at a time. So I've got the back of my left shirt on the front here, and it's like that. And then I'm going to take the back of my center shirt. If the shirt is plain on the back side, it doesn't really matter which side goes out. Maybe if you're really persnickety, you can tell the difference. I can, but just because I'm persnickety, so I can tell. So you can see from just me pinching these, the difference when I go to pin them and you sew those two sides together. That will be the raw edge margin that's going to be on the inside of the quilt. So I did the inside, I did the top layer the opposite way that I'm really doing the back layer. So I'm going to show you really quickly, same thing where I lay these out. Just make your squares as flat as you can with your hands and then go about pinning them. Sometimes I go from one edge to the other. Sometimes I kind of start in the middle and split the difference with the pins. But you do want to do about an inch, if you're not comfortable sewing, 2 inches or so apart on the pins. Jersey's what t-shirts are made of. It can be a little bit difficult to sew, so sometimes it's helpful to have more pins, and you can kind of use them as rails that your sewing machine will kind of help to guide the fabric through more consistently than it would be on the fabric alone. That's actually another reason that I do it rows and then all of them together instead of columns, because most t-shirts, it's easier to sew this seam than it is to sew across the bottom. So I'm using a straight stitch. I've just finished the first seam there of the fronts. And anytime I start a seam, I don't really worry about trimming the threads too much. I don't care that much about that kind of thing. But I do, and you'll see it here, go forward and then back and then sew the whole thing. That helps to reinforce the edges. So as you're working with your rows, the thread doesn't start to come loose and you lose all the sewing progress you made. So just a nice wide straight stitch is what you're going to use, and I use that across the whole project because it is a stretchy fabric. So if you use a wider straight stitch rather than like a 1mm stitch, it's not going to stretch the fabric as much and you'll get more of a square straight line finish. And you can see here too how I line the edge of the fabric up with the edge of the tape, and that helps me keep my stitches nice and straight. The straighter your lines are, the flatter all of your squares will be. So I'm unpinning my first two, well, these two. So there's the front of that row, and then I am going to take the front of the next shirt, and you can see I went left, middle, right on the fronts of the shirts, and what I'm actually doing on the back is right, middle, left. So I take the right side of the right t-shirt and pin it to that side of the row that I'm working on. You can see how this is kind of a difficult thing to talk about with words. I hope if you're having trouble, I would suggest watching the video all the way through so you get kind of an idea of how it's supposed to go, rather than, I would definitely not recommend turning the video off and just listening to me talk. But you can see here how all the seams will be on the inside, all the designs on the t-shirts are facing up, and then this is the back row of those same shirts. So this is the plain middle that I have, and then I'm going to take the right side of the back of that shirt and sew it onto that other side of the right side of the middle back of the shirt. I like to go t-shirt by t-shirt instead of, do all the fronts and then do all of the backs, because for some reason it's easier for me to keep track of. Whatever way you can keep track of it, that's fine. But you can see how I go t-shirt by t-shirt, make sure all the raw edges are on the inside. You can always pin and check it and then sew it. That's always the best thing to do. So same thing here. I am just lining up the right side of the t-shirt, the raw edge, with the left side of that tape that I used. There is a guide, and I always go back and double over, hit the reverse at the edge of every seam. And you can see sometimes because I'm averaging the middle on all the squares, sometimes they don't line up, and I just kind of average where the fabric hits on that tape too. The most important thing is that you're just keeping your lines straight. Anything else you can work out in the wash. So I finished sewing those. I took all the pins out. You can see I've gone straight through the shirts. There's the front and the back of the right one, the front and the back here of the middle, and then the front and the back here of this one on the left. So you are going to go ahead and just finish the rest of your t-shirts in that same manner. I do all the rows in a row. This is my third row, and then I'll do my fourth row. And here are all of my finished fronts, you can see. So once you kind of get the math done for all of your rows, the rows are honestly the most difficult part of this project. Next, we just assemble all the rows. So I take my first row and my second row, and the most important thing is to line up the seam between all of your t-shirts. That's what's going to make your shirt quilt look nice and clean. Even if they don't line up, it's still going to look great, but that clean square where all those 90-degree angles meet, that's going to be the sign of a fine quilt. So I flip the second row upside down, technically, right? When I flip the right sides together, and then I am just carefully pinning these. I always start where those two seams intersect. You can see technically the second row is upside down, but when you pin it and sew it and flip it back, all the designs will be right side up facing the same way. So that's what's most important. So I line up all of my square seams. Again, I'm just averaging from the middles to make sure everything is as centered as I can, but I want to make those two lines line up as much as possible, because when I sew straight across those, that if they miss, that's where you're really going to be able to see. So I try and line those up and pin. And remember, you're not doing it exactly at the edge there. You're doing it really about the 1/2 inch or 5/8 of an inch, whatever you decided your seam allowance was going to be. That's where you need the two lines to line up. So I just take a pin on one side of those two lines and then on the other, and I do fold my seams flat when I'm pinning. You can see here I have the top of the neck of that t-shirt, but it's going to get eaten, I guess, by the seam allowance. It'll be in the margin and it won't show once we finally sew. So if your t-shirts aren't quite lining up flat when you line up those seams, just start averaging from the middle with your pins and flattening it as you go, and that will kind of spread any extra fabric you might have on one row than the other throughout the entire seam. So if it ends up being gathered a little bit, it's not going to be as noticeable. And then usually towards the end, I will just go from the middle to the outside, because you can always trim up the outsides as much as you need to. So I'm just going to keep pinning there. You can see how I did the whole row at once. And then same thing, I will just start sewing it. I do a little bit wider, I think, on the seam allowance on the rows than I do when I'm just doing the squares. But that helps if your squares didn't quite line up. You kind of eat that extra that might be on some of the squares and not all of them throughout the whole row. It lets you average it a little bit better. So I am just kind of using both of my hands to guide, making sure that line is straight, and then finishing up that row. So you can see after I pull all the pins out here, I just lay it flat on the floor, and then you can see even though that one was upside down, right, all the raw edges are on the inside, and they're all going to be facing the same way. So you can see this one I did not do so well on the 90, and this one I did really well. So it just be like that, but that's okay. Do your best, and ultimately it's a memory quilt for you to remember all your cool t-shirts. So you just keep going in the front and the back. I do the third row same way. I line up those upright seams, flip the right sides together, and pin and sew. Rather than show you the same thing 8 more times, you just continue in the same manner. Here's all of my front rows sewed together and all of my back rows sewed together. And you can see how when it's all done, here's the front, the seams are on the back, here's the backs, and the seams are on the inside. So next you'll need some quilting batting. They sell this at Michael's or Joann's. You're going to need to make sure you get one that is the same dimensions or larger than all of your shirts sewn together, because this is going inside of your blanket. So this is what it looks like when it's out of the bag, and what you're going to do is take the back side of your t-shirts of your quilt, seam side down. I use the floor, and then I use the right sides of the front side of my quilt and put the two right sides together. The seams will be up or down. You're making a sandwich. So again, you can try and line up from all of your corners, and then you're going to take the batting and put it on the very, very top of your sandwich. So the front of your quilt and the back of the quilt should have the right sides together, and then you're going to go ahead and put the batting on the very, very top. And then you just pin all the way around. So if your batting piece is larger than your two sides of your quilt, you would just go ahead and trim it all the way around and then get to sewing. So on this one, I use a slightly larger seam allowance. I move the tape a little bit farther away from where the needle is, and that helps me just in case there's spots where maybe the batting is a little bit wider than the rest of the t-shirts. Maybe one t-shirt didn't quite get it all the way. And you also will notice here that I sew with the batting down towards the bottom of the sewing machine, not up towards the presser foot. Watch carefully how I turn this 90-degree angle at the end of the first side here. So you want to kind of approach it, whatever your seam allowance is. I kind of eyeball it, and then when you lift the presser foot with the needle still in the fabric, you can kind of see if it's the same distance. And if it's not, you just get a little bit closer and do it again. So here I'm just doing the entire next side and the other corners. And instead of sewing all the way around this rectangle, you want to leave about 6 inches. So actually I started, instead of at the corner, about 6 inches down, because I always forget to not just run right off the end here. But you're going to need, however wide, about 6 inches, because you're going to need to stick your hand inside to turn it inside out. So first, I like to trim the edges. I just go around as close as I feel comfortable to the seam and cut off of the extra t-shirt and batting. It's totally not super necessary to do that, but you do want to at least do the corners like this. Just cut diagonally across so that when it gets folded, it's not weirdly bunched up in the corners. But if you do decide to trim, just make sure you leave this part here at the end, the 6 inches where you're going to stick your hand in. Don't trim that part at all, because you're going to top stitch it and you're going to need that extra fabric there to turn it under. So you want to stick your hand after you turn take the pins out. You'll stick your hand in the gap there between the two t-shirt layers, not between the batting layer. So you can see that hole, and I actually usually just go directly diagonally across to the farthest corner, because that's the hardest one to reach, and then you just pull the whole thing right side out. And then I go to each corner and kind of do a pinch and wiggle, and that just keeps the seams as flat as possible. So I am taking now where I stuck my hand in that gap, you're going to need to turn it under, and so all that means is that you're going to fold those two flaps in so that that seam gets on the inside and looks nice like the rest of it does. So I'm going to close up here, and you can see you just kind of work on it so that the two sides are evenly folded, and that you just follow it with the pins. So you just go along folding it in, and it gets a little bit tougher towards the corner, but if it's rough, just keep going. You do want to just make sure that the rest of it is pretty well flat before you get to this part. Sometimes it can mess it up if you're a little bit wrinkled on the rest of it. So lay it out as flat as you can. Again, a floor is good if you have one. A carpet is even better. So instead of starting on the corner, I start towards that middle because it can kind of suck back into your machine. So I go towards the corner of my quilt instead of away from it, and you just give it a good straight stitch. You do want to make sure you get that back and forth there at the start and the bottom. So here you'll get a better look at the kind of pinch and wiggle. You just want to make all of these sides as flat as you can, and then go around and pin. You can be pretty loose with your pins here, only about every 2 inches or so. And then I adjust my seam allowance to about 1 inch or 1.5 inches. And I do also want to start here wherever, instead of starting at the edge, I start where the color is the same as the thread I'm using, so it makes this start a little bit less obvious. And then I just give it a nice top stitch through the whole blanket. So I have like 1 inch or 1.5 inches border of stitching around the whole shirt. It doesn't matter if I go over the design, but it helps kind of bring the whole quilt together and give it an even look. So again, you can see that back and forth there now that I've finished, and you just go all the way around. So it'll take some time, sit on the couch, pull all the pins out, and then it's mostly done. But just lay it flat one more time, and then anywhere the shirt's join in those 4 corners, I will just put a pin through and then do a little bit of hand sewing. This is the only actual quilting for this project, but I thread the needle with my same thread I used to sew the rest of it, and I double it over like this and tie a knot. So I'm using 2 threads, and all this does is so that if you ever have to wash your quilt, you aren't going to get all of the batting bunched up in one corner. So you just kind of tack it with this little thread, and I kind of just do it in an X along the seams. The technique here does not matter. It doesn't matter how you tack it. I usually actually just shove the whole thing in my machine and give it a zigzag stitch, and it just keeps it secure. So you can see here how it turns out when it's all finished. If you have any questions, I would totally love to hear them. I would love to see what you guys make, and I will see you guys next time.